Hi everyone, my name is Udit and today I'm going to be talking about the PayPal product manager interview process. At the end of this video, you should have a really good understanding of the process itself, what interviewers are looking for in each round, as well as a couple of tips on how to prepare for each of the rounds that I'll be talking about. At the end of this video, I'll also share one PM interviewing tip that's worked particularly well for candidates interviewing at PayPal. Quick introduction, I'm from Prepfully. On Prepfully, you can practice for free with other candidates who are also preparing for their interviews. You can also get specific targeted advice on your readiness level and the gaps in your preparation from an interview coach. We've got a bunch of PayPal PMs who are interview coaches, for instance. And finally, you can also get your resume reviewed if you haven't applied yet from recruiters who are hiring for PMs in a range of companies. So in that context, this video has been put together with the help of the same PayPal product managers who've been guiding and mentoring hundreds of candidates. Right then, enough context, on to the interview process. In a nutshell, there are 3 to 5 steps in PayPal's product manager interview process. The first of these is the recruiter phone screen. The next 2 to 5 rounds are progressive in nature. So there are usually gaps between them, and your invitation to the next round will often depend on your success in the previous round. The second round within this whole bucket of progressive interviews is usually going to be with your hiring manager, and they act as a first filter and determine whether you progress onto the next rounds. Those next rounds will often be with other product managers at PayPal, but they can also be with some of your stakeholders like UX designers or data scientists or engineers that you would be working with were you to get hired. Let's briefly talk about the first round because this one's relatively straightforward. There's the recruiter phone screen, typically takes 20-25 minutes, nearly always over the phone, sometimes online. Your recruiter is basically trying to assess your high-level experiential and cultural fit for both the company but also for the role that they're hiring for. In that context, I've got 5 tips, all very, very obvious in that sense. The first is to be super familiar with your past work. Make sure you have a story you can talk about from each of the past roles that you've held. The second, organize your thoughts in advance around topics like what your contribution was and what you learned from the experience, because they don't care about the achievement overall as much as the part you played within it. Third, keep your answers short and crisp. They're not going to deep dive too much. They're basically trying to get a high level understanding of should you be progressed or not. Fourth, and this one's a little important, make sure you have a good reason for why you're applying to PayPal. Candidates typically apply for a range of companies and everyone kind of knows that, but you should have a good reason for how PayPal fits into your long-term career plans. And fifth, this round is nearly certainly going to begin with that old favorite, tell me about yourself, so just be prepared for it. Next up then are the craft rounds. There are between 2 and 5 of these. Usually they're about 45 minutes per round. Different teams can set their own processes for hiring at PayPal. So often a team will set up a slightly different process to a different team. Some teams have as few as just 2 of these rounds. Other teams have 3, 4, 5. They can also have a full on-site loop, virtual on-site these days, in which you have like multiple interviews back to back with different people. The format is flexible, but the types of questions you're going to face across all of them are pretty standard. Each interview can cover multiple types of questions, but there are roughly 6 types of questions that you should look to preparing for, an extra 7th if you're interviewing for a technical product manager role. These 6 types of questions are product strategy questions, product design questions, experiential questions, behavioral questions, case study questions, that's the 5th type. The 6th type is diagnosis questions, and then if you're interviewing for a technical PM role, then you're also going to be asked a couple of technical questions. So for each of these question types, I'm going to briefly give an example of what your interviewer is looking for, an example of a question that might come, and maybe if I have one, a tip on how to go about preparing for it. So let's talk product strategy questions first. In product strategy questions, your interviewer is trying to get an idea of how you think big picture and big vision for a product in the context of a market landscape, and how you narrow that down into something that can be viably built. Question on this front can be pretty abstract, like what could be PayPal's next big product, for instance. In product design questions, though, which is the second bucket, your interviewer wants to see that big picture thinking translated into a viable product, as well as the steps you take in between. So they want to go all the way from what your vision might be and what your ultimate goals are, but moving down to the customer you're solving for, what their pain points or needs might look like, what some viable solutions could be before you prioritize within them, and show that path step by step to building whatever you've prioritized. Questions here tend to be a lot more specific. You'll have a scope and a remit upfront. So a good example of a question that a candidate reported being asked recently was, how would you improve Amazon search results, for instance? The next type of question that comes up really often is an experiential question. In this question, your interviewer is basically trying to assess your past craft experience as a product manager, as well as its relevance to the role you're interviewing for. So what's key for this round is to just practice your stories enough and make sure that you can demonstrate those competencies necessary for that role, but also go to the next level and show how you keep improving as a PM. The fact that you can introspect from your past experiences and apply those learnings to future projects that you're part of. The fact that you keep evolving, that you improve at the different aspects of the craft, all the way from how you manage stakeholders to how you have technical discussions to how you design products or think about strategy, because PayPal wants to see people who continually become better. It's really important to note that this interview is also often taken by a stakeholder who might not be a PM. So for instance, a UX designer or an engineering manager or a software engineer or sometimes a data scientist might take this interview, especially if there's one in the team that you're going to be working for which the role's been opened, because they want to see not just can you do your job, but what it's like to actually work with you and what other people might have faced when working with you in your past experiences. So for the first three types of examples I've given, I have just one common tip. The only way to actually ace this is through practice. Practice with friends, practice with colleagues if you know others who are interviewing. Practice by yourself. If you don't have those, record yourself. Speak to yourself in front of the mirror. See where you and ah. For instance, see where your stories aren't concise and short and crisp and to the point. But also ultimately start practicing at some point with coaches who can give you that advice on, are you communicating what you're planning to? So is your key message getting across? Is it getting across in the right way? Is it satisfying the needs of the interviewer in this context? And are they seeing what they need to from your interview to be able to give you a hiring decision? So that kind of feedback is invaluable. And we've got a bunch of PayPal PMs who can map it back to what PayPal needs and give you that specific advice. Next up then are behavioral questions. These usually take the form of either tell me about a time XYZ happened or how would you deal with XYZ happening if it occurred to you, right? And the first looks at, did you deal with the sort of situation in the past that might be relevant to the future? The second looks at, regardless of whether you faced it in the past, do you have sufficient maturity as a PM to be able to figure out how you deal with it in a theoretical context, of course, were you to face it? So some questions that were recently reported by PM candidates in the behavioral ecosystem were, tell me about a time you faced a conflict with your engineering counterpart. Another example was, how would you deny a feature request from senior management? So these are both good examples of what you might face in a live interview. We have one really crucial tip for this. Make sure before your interview that you are up to date with PayPal's latest set of values. So for instance, they're currently innovation, collaboration, wellness, inclusion. And the reason I'm suggesting you should be aware of these is because it then becomes a really easy thing to map your answers to these values. And if there's an opportunity to surface an example of where you've demonstrated, say, innovation or demonstrated collaboration, where you brought people together on a very controversial topic and achieved something, then please take it, because these automatically align you with what your interviewer is also going to be filtering for, because they themselves are supposed to be adhering to these values. So that's a trick for behavioral questions that's particularly effective. I would recommend trying to map all your stories to the values of the company you're generally interviewing with, and PayPal is no exception. The next type of question then was case study questions. These are definitely rarer, but they do come up. They definitely come up for senior roles. For instance, a candidate was given a case study questions around expanding PayPal to a specific use case in a new market. I think it was business users or SMEs in a new market. So for these, it's basically really important to follow a structured approach and not shoot ideas from the hip. It's important to show that you can think big picture before narrowing it down to how that affects PayPal before talking through what your recommendation and plan of action could potentially be. Diagnosis questions are the sixth category. These are also increasingly common. They often take the shape of a certain metric is in decline. What are you going to do about it? Your interviewer in these sorts of questions is trying to see, can you methodically break down a problem all the way from the realm of everything that could happen down to a particular nuance that they basically want to lead you in the direction of. So it's really important to make this a conversation. Keep asking questions. Always surface the entire breadth of options that you might pick from and ask, hey, do you want me to go down a certain path? Could it potentially be XYZ that occurred, and let them cut off the branches rather than making assumptions? Finally, for technical interviews, these are largely going to come up if you're interviewing for a technical PM role. My recommendation would be to brush up on technical concepts, but also specifically on technical concepts relevant to the role you're interviewing for. So an example is if you're interviewing for a security PM role, then please brush up on security principles and what you could potentially do to eliminate loopholes, what you might do in the case of an incident, and so on. If you're interviewing for an API PM role, for instance, then you might want to think about what your success metrics for a good API could look like, or designing a good API and the principles behind that. Or, for instance, what are some things to keep in mind when setting technical metrics for a team? The entire realm of questions that could come up in an API ecosystem are basically fair territory. Your interviewers here are trying to understand not just are you technically sound and do you invest the effort into understanding a particular ecosystem, but also can you explain technical concepts in without being verbose and in a concise way, and can you hold your own in discussions and guide discussions with potentially very technical stakeholders like engineering managers and architects into a resolution and into a conclusion that you can then start delivering against. Right then, that's all for this guide. In a nutshell, the recruiter phone round, just the basics, followed by the hiring manager round, the most important filter, followed by all the rest of the rounds where you need to keep demonstrating your competence across a range of potential skills that you're going to be queried on. Last thing before this video ends is the PayPal specific tip I wanted to give you. This is something that a lot of candidates have used successfully, and it generally works across a lot of companies, this particular tip, but it's particularly powerful for PayPal. And the tip is your recruiter is basically your secret weapon in this context, and that's for two reasons. One, every team in PayPal has the ability to set its own interview process, which means you are absolutely reliant on your recruiter to not just give you the high level information on, hey, you have an interview on this date and time, but the specifics of who's going to be interviewing you and what they're looking for. And the second part is particularly crucial because then you can make sure that you prepare not just the high level, hey, I'm preparing for strategy, but the nuances of what specific skills related to strategy they're looking for. So are they looking for past experience in expanding to new markets? Or are they looking for the ability to articulate big picture NPD, new product visions that the team might potentially be exploring? Or for instance, if it's an engineering stakeholder, they're likely going to not just assess what your technical skills are, but also what it's like to interview or to work with you as a person. So having an assortment of stories ready on hand could be particularly powerful for this particular interview. So leverage your recruiter much more than you would for a company like Google, for instance, where the guidance is relatively standardized across all the rounds you might be facing. The second reason for why your recruiter is your secret weapon is because they're so heavily engaged in designing the interview process with the hiring manager. They also know a lot about that role and that team that they otherwise would simply not know. And by this, what I mean is what's the path of that team? Where is it positioned in the entire company, but also what its growth plans are, what the growth plan of this particular role could be. And these are all things to, again, quiz them on, because then you can make your answers map to this. An example here is like maybe they're planning to expand this team scope and hire 3 PMs. That's an opportunity for you to demonstrate the fact that you've worked on a scope similar to this, where there are multiple PMs who divided a product into its components and split up responsibilities. You could also articulate how this maps into your career path, in that you want to move into a leadership role or a people manager role or an individual contributor role where you'll become specialized in a domain. The specifics aren't important. I'm using these to demonstrate the example, but the idea is quiz them for that information on that role and on that team, and make sure that you use it in your interviews, because it's going to demonstrate the next level of maturity that a lot of other candidates frankly will not. So it gives you an edge. Good. That's all from us, basically. If you have questions about any of what I just went through, or you want me to deep dive into a particular aspect, or if you encounter something that's different to what I tell you, God forbid, hope that doesn't happen, please by all means let us know in the comments and we'll make sure to respond. If you feel ready for some practice or just want a sense check of your readiness level, you can book a mock interview or an advice session with a PayPal product manager on Prepfully. I'll include the link in the description. In the description, I'll also link to a bunch of other helpful advice, such as a written guide, which covers broadly what I just covered right now, interview questions that have been asked recently, blog posts that deal with nuances of certain aspects of PM interviewing. So feel free to check those out. Otherwise, I hope you found this useful. If you did, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And otherwise, thanks and good luck.
Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please subscribe. Our website is prepfully.com. We've got lots of interview questions there. You can also schedule a mock interview with one of our experts. You can find the link in the description below. All the best from us at Prepfully, and we hope you totally rock your interview.